Hello, hello, hello! And welcome back to Bento Bureau, the show where we talk about Japan from an international perspective. I'm your host, as always, standing up this time, Basim Hijazi, or Buzz. And with me, as always, my wonderful friend, Bastian Hart. How you doing, man?
Hi, Buzz. Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I got my first vaccine shot last week, so feeling much better. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm on my first as well. I'm actually taking my second one tomorrow, so trying not to freak out about that. But the first one I didn't really feel anything. It was all good. But you know how they say about the second one, that's really gonna make or break the situation. So I'm trying not to panic. I'm trying to stay optimistic, but I'm feeling good, and I'm feeling very excited today because not only did we reach 40 episodes of this show, Bento Bureau, so far, we're actually kicking off the start of an all new season today, right from this
Mm.
episode. And for those that have been following us in the past year, you know very well that we've done a lot of shows on business, entrepreneurship, the startup world, and we'd like to first of all extend our deepest gratitude to all of our esteemed guests that took the time out of their schedules to share their insights with us and with you guys. And of course, to everyone tuning in today, your support is always appreciated. Thank you very, very much for tuning in to Bento Bureau.
Yeah, thanks so much, Buzz. I can't believe it that we actually have done 40 episodes since 2016. We decided to rekindle actually this episode or this podcast last April, so it has been really just a year since we've been doing Bento Bureau again. And back then, we decided to do it as a live streaming podcast, and it was just a live streaming podcast on Facebook, not on YouTube. And then we kind of progressed. We started with a couple of friends, first of all, people that we knew, and then we started to invite some external guests, let's put it that way, people that we don't know about before. We reached out to guests who could talk on the show. And yeah, there have been some changes over the time in the team, for sure. I mean, at the very beginning, Long was also with us, and we continued doing this live streaming, trying to improve the quality. And in the end, after a year, we spoke about female entrepreneurship, Japanese business, startups, coding, programming. So we really progressed, and I think we've actually really tried over the past year to do the best out of this podcast. And now we're also back on audio, which is fantastic. So we're now live streaming podcasts on YouTube, on Facebook, and we're doing this also now again on audio because we believe that the content that we produce is actually worthwhile to listen to. And now we're in season 5, where we want to focus on a theme, and the theme is identity.
Absolutely, Bastian. Couldn't have said it better myself. And may I say it's been an honor doing this show with you. I think it's been
Same.
a really great opportunity for me to not just expand my knowledge about Japan, but to grow as a person. I couldn't have picked a better co-host myself. So thank you for that. Just to give my
I
final thank
can
you to
I
you.
can only give that thank you back to you as well. It has been an absolute honor. And Buzz, I mean, all the viewers, all the listeners, if you look around here on the live stream, all the setup, all the audio, the images, the little clips that we've been producing, the logos, the music has been all in Buzz hands. He has been doing a fantastic job, and it's just lovely. Even the little jingle you hear in the audio podcast. I could listen to that really on loop because I love that so much. I've been listening to it since 2016, actually, and I'm like, oh man, it's just 30 seconds long, but I can listen to this all and over and over and over again. So, Buzz, thanks so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you very much for that. And thank you for tooting my horn, Bastian, and giving the audience a little bit of a behind the scenes works of the show. Yes, I did make that jingle. I made it in about a day. I was just fooling around on the keyboard, and I've made something that was pretty catchy. So
It's
I hope
awesome.
you
Yeah.
guys like it as well. But with that, going back to our subject this season, as Bastian has mentioned, we're going to be discussing a little more about what does the term identity mean in the context of Japan, be it what it means to be Japanese or other identities that exist within Japan. For those, who are tuning in today, I want to ask a question, and maybe you can leave your answer to the question in the comments section or just shoot us a message on social media. What do you think of when you think of Japan? How would you describe it? what is your impression of Japan? It might be a very simple question from the surface, but when I think of myself and how I would describe it, I might struggle. Actually, I can certainly say, the way I describe it today is, I take a lot of more time and thought to really think about what I'm saying, compared to what I said 10 to 15 years ago, when I thought someone who's so into Japan was so knowledgeable about Japan, which is not necessarily the truth. And I think we can both, relate to that sort of thing. So I'd be interested to hear what you have to think. And, that's what we're looking to deconstruct in this season. And to start that off, we're going to be discussing in today's episode how the world sees Japan, or more specifically, how the media portrays Japan. And with that, let's switch this monologue to our, discussion with today's guest. He's a research associate and a lecturer that teaches at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures. And he's someone who has been studying and observing the portrayal of Japan in British media for quite a long time. His name is Christopher Hayes, and we'll switch it to our conversation with him right now, which I think you'll thoroughly enjoy.
Pleasure to be here, and thank you for your kind introduction. So yes, I'm a research associate at the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures, and that's a research institute that's based at the University of East Anglia in Norwich, the United Kingdom. And I'm particularly concerned in my research with the representation of Japan. So in many ways, not Japan itself, but how we perceive it abroad. And I mainly focus on the UK, because for many people, representations of Japan, be they in newspapers, be they on TV or in film, wherever those representations are, that's the closest that they ever get to Japan. And so I take a deep dive into these representations and look at what it is they say about Japan and some of the issues that come up as a result of that. And yeah, that's something we're talking about today, I think.
The Japanese portrayal of media, or the how Japan's society is actually portrayed in media, is quite quirky, I would say, sometimes even a bit weird. And it's not really portraying the country itself in the best light, I would say, even. How is Japan actually portrayed? How would you describe it in the British, but also in the global media?
I think it's such a big question, but I think really at the core of it, that Japan is portrayed as the other, as completely and utterly different to, say, the United Kingdom or wherever it is that Japan is being written about. Maybe less so in other East Asian countries, so maybe Korea or China, but certainly in the UK, Europe, the United States, what we call the West. Japan is just characterized as being so completely and utterly different. Certainly in my research, I've boiled it down to three sort of characteristics: that Japan is unique, that it's unknowable, and that it's unchanging. And I think it's that second one that's particularly visible, that it's unknowable, that no matter how much you try to talk about Japan and how much, it's spoken about in the media, there's always this point that you can never quite know Japan, that it's difficult to understand. It's something about it is difficult to grasp. And you say that, yes, Japan is it's shown as being a bit weird, a bit crazy, a bit wacky. And it's at the core of that is that it's just different to us. And that difference is exaggerated and framed in such a way that it is seen to be this crazy, crazy place. And yeah, I'll stop there because I could just keep going for the next 2 hours, and I know we've got a lot of questions to get through. So, I'll come back to this over the course of it, but Japan in particular, when it comes to its portrayal, be it, so when I started my research, I focused mostly on British news, so newspapers and news websites, but I've since expanded to look more at, say, television, for example. But in depictions about Japan, there's this huge emphasis on traditional Japan, on its traditions, its customs, its history. If you ever look at, say, a television documentary about Japan or some kind of representation of Japan, almost certainly you're going to get those traditional elements of the geisha, of the samurai, of the temples and the cherry blossoms. And this is very much seen as this fixed idea of Japan, that this is sort of at the very center of Japan. This is what Japan is and what it has always been and what it will always be. And yes, of course, we're in the 21st century, and we're talking to each other despite being completely different places using this technology. And of course, Japan has that technology too. And I'm not saying that that's ignored. But in spite of all of these changes that are happening globally, Japan is nonetheless, in many ways, perceived exactly as it was, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Ever since really, let's say, in my case in Britain, we first became really interested in Japan, particularly around the Victorian era, the things that we focus on when we look at Japan are exactly the same. Maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit, but one way I like to illustrate this is if I focus on my research of British television shows about Japan. In 1987, the Australian broadcaster Clive James, who worked in the UK, he was very popular in the UK, more so than he was in Australia. He made a documentary about Japan. He went and visited Japan, he traveled the country, did this for British television. Now, if you took this documentary, I think it was 2 parts, if you took this documentary and compared it to something made 2-3 years ago, so every other year, sometimes every year, on British television, there will be a program about Japan. Usually a celebrity or some well-known personality will go to Japan with their aim of discovering something about the country or solving a problem. And usually it's a comedian, so I'm not sure how a comedian who doesn't really know anything about Japan is going to solve Japan's problems, but there you are. So in the last couple of years, we've had Japan with Sue Perkins. Sue Perkins is a very popular British comedian. We also, James May, our man in Japan. We also had the British TV chef Paul Hollywood go to Japan. There was Joanna Lumley's Japan. You have all of these programs. But if you compare them to this program from over 30 years ago, it's uncanny how similar they are. It's striking, in fact, that what they show, the beats of the programs, even the structure, the order they do things in, is exactly the same. There'll be a trip on the Shinkansen. They'll go to the high rises of Tokyo and see the neon lights, but then they'll then go out into the countryside and see the temples. It's exactly the same. There's nothing new to say. All that happens is with every new program, they'll insert maybe one new destination, whatever's currently popular in the news. So in the last year or so, what's been popular has been this sort of Mario Kart tour you can do around the city, where you get in a little go-kart in a costume and drive around the roads. That's been very popular with tourists, and because it is a bit fun, it's caught the imaginations of people. So that's now worked its way into these programs. So you get these small additions, but they don't really tell you anything new about Japan. Really, the essence of what these programs tell you about Japan hasn't changed in 30 plus years.
I find that so fascinating because it kind of shows as well that the image of how we see Japan hasn't really changed over the years, right? Or the interest that we have for Japan might have not actually changed, because you can see it, and as you said, if the documentaries haven't really changed on what they touch upon in essence, well, the interesting points, the ones that they always try to sell, most of the time I would say even either the very traditional ones like the samurai or the geisha, or the very quirky, wacky ones like, I don't know, these cosplays or anime and manga. It's really like these, Yeah, these focal points have been very much on the how should I say, the not the little parts of Japan, but like the most outstanding ones, like the ones which really peak out as unique, as quirky, as different.
Yeah.
So we find that so fascinating. And you know, while prepping actually for the show, I also looked at a couple of documentaries, and yes, you're right. They always focus. It doesn't matter if it's like a children's show or if it's a show for adults. They always bring in geisha or kimono or sushi or usually the samurai. It's following a certain pattern for sure.
Yeah.
So
No.
it's not only Britain. I feel like I'm not sure how it is for you, Buzz, in Qatar. Like, but that's how Germany is also portraying kind of the Japan in the media.
Hey everyone, just doing a quick re-record here because I had a couple of audio issues during the episode. But what I was saying in response to Bastian's question is, in the Middle East here where I live, and Arabs in general, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of every Arab. Of course, you know, I'm drawing stereotypes to a certain extent here, but I don't think we buck the trend based on what we were discussing in any way. I think you see the same sort of exotification of Japan from the eyes of Arabs here. You see the same sort of stereotypes being pushed. Japan, the wild and wacky, Japan, the mysterious, Japan, the misunderstood. You know, in Arabic, you often hear the phrase "Kawkab al-Yaban," which translates to "planet Japan." So, you know, they're clearly sort of represented as the other, the foreign, which is quite an interesting, you know, phenomenon. But I don't think it's anything new compared to what we've discussed so far. But I would really be interested to hear what you think, whoever's listening. You know, if you're not Japanese and you sort of learned about Japan through the media growing up, what was your own experiences learning about it? Leave us, shoot us a message on social media or leave it in the comment section below. It would be great to know a little bit about your own experiences learning about Japan for the first time. And I also was mentioning during the episode that I was reading this book, Intro to Japanese Society by Yoshio Sugimoto. And in his chapter number 7, which he talks about Japaneseness, ethnicity, and minority groups, one of the really interesting things he mentions, in contrast to what we were saying about international media and how they speak about or frame Japan, Japan itself is sort of guilty of the same thing to a certain extent. I mean, he says here, Japan has frequently been portrayed as a uniquely homogeneous society, both racially and ethnically. So for decades, the Japanese leadership had inculcated in the populace the myths of Japanese racial purity and of the ethnic superiority, which was supposed to be guaranteed by the uninterrupted lineage of the imperial household over centuries. Basically, what he's saying is that Japanese leadership for centuries has sort of been pushing this ideal of Japan's uniqueness, Japan's homogeneity, as a sort of driving force for, you know, their success. Even he goes on to say that certain analysts even try to attribute Japan's economic bubble to the fact that, you know, they are sort of united in their drive to work hard, and that comes from their sort of homogeneity and unity and racial purity, which is very interesting to say the least, and something that, you know, you can certainly see even in today, you know, with you know, how they sort of frame themselves in popular media or in the tourism sector. Japan always sort of, you know, they're guilty of this themselves. They sort of frame themselves in this really, you know, interesting, mysterious, or not mysterious, but like different sort of way, so that, you know, it certainly worked on me and my family who wanted to visit Japan years ago. They always saw Japan as this really different place where, you know, you're going to see things where you don't see anywhere else in the world. So it's really interesting that Japan uses that tactic in contrast to what international media even does.
That is, you know, I wonder, why is Japan doing that? Isn't it kind of soft power, right? Isn't it? Because of all these little things that Japan stands for, Japan is known for, they can kind of influence other countries to make them interested to come in Japan. But do they actually portray the reality, would you say, Chris?
I mean, what is reality? That's a really deep
Matrix.
question. Yeah, let's not answer that today. But yeah, no, there's so many interesting things to unpack here, and certainly, yes, the Japanese government is as guilty of these kinds of selective representations as foreign media, and I don't think there's a single purpose as to why they're doing it. You can trace it back so far, as you're saying, going back millennia. I only learned the other day that when we think of Japan, we often think of the cherry blossom, especially around April time. Cherry blossom season's just ended, I think, at least in parts of Japan. It sweeps through Japan. We have this strong association of cherry blossoms with Japan. But historically, that wasn't the case. Historically, if you go back far enough, there was an obsession with plum blossom. But in around the 13th century, I believe this was, I'm sure pre-modern Japan experts will be yelling at their computer screens right now, there was a shift because Japan wanted to assert itself independently and move away from its reliance and its affiliations with China, which historically Japan had been a vassal state of China. It had been supplicant to China. And so it wanted to move away and assert itself more independently. We are Japan. And the tradition of this appreciation for plum blossom had come from China. So there was this conscious decision of, well, plum blossoms, Chinese, we're going to ignore those from now on. We'll pick something Japanese. And so the tradition of cherry blossom appreciation and viewing was born, but purely as a political move away from China. And this sort of idea of using Japanese culture for identity building has been this huge thing throughout Japanese history, and particularly in the 20th century following the end of World War II and Japan's defeat. National identity was this hugely important thing for the Japanese government to create a new Japan. Especially when people were dealing with that loss in so many ways, the destruction wrought by the war, that feeling of defeat and being in part occupied by the Americans. People needed a new national identity, and so the government forged ahead with shaping a new Japanese identity by looking to the past and taking what is great about Japan and its traditions and emphasizing this, long unbroken chain of Japanese history and the Japanese people being pure and everything else, bundling it all together to give people this sense of national pride. And, we still see the effects of that today. It wasn't that long ago when a senior Japanese politician was suggesting that the reason that COVID rates in Japan were low is because of Japanese people's unique characteristics. That is, they're genetically different to everyone else, and so cannot catch COVID. That's what it is. But of course, as you know, and as many of the viewers / listeners will know, that Japan isn't as homogenous as that. You have the indigenous populations, such as the Ainu, who were repressed for years. You have second, third, fourth generation Koreans and Chinese living in Japan. You have Japanese Brazilians. You have more recent immigrants coming to Japan. And even if you just focus on the Japanese people themselves, there's not a single culture. They have subcultures just like anywhere else. But this idea of a unified Japanese culture is a very strong one, and it's a very appealing one. And it's used externally as well, as you say, for soft power, for sort of building that positive international image. And one way in which it's very successful is tourism. So if you look at my experience is mostly in the English language, but if you look at global tourism campaigns for Japan, official ones from the Japanese National Tourism Organization, they will use these exact same kinds of imagery that you'll see in foreign media. So they will have the geisha and the samurai in the temples. They will have the high rises and the bullet train and the technology. And quite often what is done is it's shown as almost like a dichotomy, that you've got on the one hand the traditional and the very historic Japan, and on the other side you've got this very high-tech Japan, this futuristic Japan. So you have these two sides that coexist. And they're very powerful in drawing tourists because people like that. It's popular, and they know, the Japanese government and the tourism organizations, although they know that you could call it an exaggeration, they know that it sells, it's popular, it's what people want to see. And yeah, I think, you were talking before about how we have these kind of almost snapshots of very particular things, and they usually are the most excessive or exaggerated things, and we focus in on those and show those to be what Japan's all about. And it's exactly the same with these kind of twin depictions of Japan being really traditional and being really high tech. There's no middle ground. Japan is one or the other or both, but there's nothing in the middle. There's no images of your average suburban street or your small town, which is just a town like anywhere else, because that's not interesting. People don't want to really know about the everyday lives of the Japanese, who have families, they go to work, they do their grocery shopping. The Japan, which really isn't all that different from anywhere else. So that Japan is kind of excluded from the image, because what people want to see are these sort of extremes.
And that's what also draws people to Japan, right? These extremes.
Absolutely.
This is exactly what you mentioned. People want to come to Japan because they want to see either sides of these extremes, or they want to see both at the same time. That's the beauty of it. I think best example is, I find always Asakusa. Like Asakusa is a very traditional place, but it's also filled with like a shopping street actually leading to the temple, and around it as well there are lots of different kinds of tourist shops, and it has lost its touch, I think, for a long time, but it's still the most visited sightseeing spot in Japan as well. And for tourists, I guess, definitely going once is interesting, but for someone who has lived a long time in Japan, I think they have always been trying to stay away from Asakusa a little bit, because it's just too overcrowded and it doesn't portray Japan in the most, how should I say, proper way, I guess. Thanks, Buzz.
Just jumping in here again, I think there is no proper way, and the same applies to any country around the world, really, or anything. I mean, who is to dictate what is proper and what is not? I think that's a very, complicated thing to go down, that sort of rabbit hole, but I don't think we should start getting rid of entertainment, because the reality is entertainment is one of the avenues where a lot of people sort of get initiated in learning more about something or being interested in something. Of course, you're not going to get, the most accurate representation of the subject matter in entertainment. TV is inevitably going to misconstrue or exaggerate to a certain extent to make things more spicy and entertaining. What we should do is make more of a conscious effort to not make blatant false claims at the very least, and try and balance that sort of content with some fact checking. Maybe one of the ways we could do that is, making an after credits scene where resources are shared or clarifications are mentioned about what was shown, what was exaggerated. Of course, this is a little difficult to implement universally in a way that makes sort of sense to everyone, but there must be something we could do better at the very least. How do we do that in a clickbait world? I have no idea. But clearly some systematic change is in dire need. And I think initiatives like Christopher's research here is the right step forward. to help inform our future policy making. And certainly, I think a deeper integration of media literacy in schools is something we need to be looking at as a mandatory subject in the future, in my opinion. Now to the follow-up question I ask here. Japan's economy has certainly changed tremendously in the past 50 years. Has the media changed its tone about Japan's relationship with technology, for instance, or just, generally its tone about the nature of Japanese society?
I wouldn't say so. I think the biggest turning point, you could say, was 1964, when Japan hosted the Tokyo Summer Olympics. And we're now in 2021, when Japan is hosting the Summer Olympics again. Whether it's going to have the same impact, that remains to be seen. But in 1964, at that point, Japan was perceived internationally as this sort of defeated nation. Okay, people didn't really have any strong associations with Japan other than those wartime memories, and maybe some associations of that more historic Japan. But the 1964 Olympics, I think they were the first internationally broadcast Olympics, like available worldwide. And this was the opportunity for Japan to showcase itself to the world, and showcase themselves they did, because as part of their preparations for the Olympics, the Japanese government undertook this huge overhaul of Tokyo's infrastructure. New roads, new rail lines, new buildings, everything was brand spanking new. And it was all completely modern. And they also used it to showcase new technological innovations. And in 1964, the Olympic year, they opened the first Shinkansen, the first bullet train line. Mm-hmm. And it brought journalists to the Olympics. So they put all of the journalists on one of these trains to take them through Japan to the Olympic Stadium. And so through this very strong image of Japan as being this advanced nation was born. And, it seems a bit silly, but I always go to the classic comedy movie Back to the Future, because I love that movie. But what's great about it is when the protagonist, Marty McFly, goes back to the past, goes back to the 1950s, he takes with him his personal video camera from the 80s, which is Japanese. And when it's examined by the 1950s Doc Brown, he's disgusted at the fact that it's Japanese, because as far as he's concerned, for a 1950s person, the Japanese just make cheap rubbish. But by the 1980s, the association is, no, Japan is this leader in technology. Mm-hmm. And so you had this huge shift, and it started in the 1960s, in 1964. And you had the growth of these electronics companies, your Sonys and your Toshibas and your Hitachis and everything else. And it did become this huge leader. And I don't think that image of Japan as high tech has changed since, even though if you look at the statistics, Korea is growing and beginning to lead the way. I think in terms of robotics, Korea has displaced Japan. China is growing as well, but the image is still of Japan. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's really changed at all. I'm just trying to think of any specific examples. I actually remember when I was doing my research, I came across a couple of articles from 2011, from around the time we had the Great East Japan disaster. So the 11th of March, when we had the tsunami, the earthquake, and then the nuclear meltdown, that triple disaster. In the British press, there were a number of articles suggesting that everything would be fine because it's Japan. They have advanced technologies. They have robots. They'll just send one of their robots in and sort it all out. Mm-hmm. Which is absurd, really. you know, Japan is obviously has a lot of robotics firms and doing lots of research in that regard. But to suggest that they already had these advanced robots that could just walk in and sort out a nuclear meltdown, it's just kind of indicative of what this international perception of Japan and technology is. And I just don't think it's really changed. One of the things I did look at was instances of where Japan is perceived as being a bit low tech. So I did a case study of articles about Japan's fax machine usage. And this started in 2012. There was an article on the BBC website about how Japan had not given up the fax machine despite the fact that pretty much every other country had. And that kind of created this snowballing effect where after that article came out, suddenly all of the other British major news publications were putting out their own articles on fax machines in Japan. And what was interesting about these was they didn't really link this discussion to the wider context of Japan's technology. So it didn't overlap with this idea of Japan being high tech. Instead, they linked it to Japan being this very traditional society. So again, this sort of two sides of the same coin. It's either very traditional or very high tech. So when it came to talking about fax machines, they didn't even discuss the high tech stuff. They focused on the tradition and suggested that fax machine usage was rooted in Japanese culture and tradition, that you could even take it back to Shinto beliefs. All these things. And what was very interesting in these articles was they were suggesting that the Japanese refused to give these machines up, that they were obsessed with them. And the language that was used basically removed any capacity for rationality and logical decision making from the Japanese. It was driven purely by emotion. There was no logic for their use of fax machines. Simply from the perspective of, say, the British author, who could perceive no actual reason for keeping them. So they just relied on that notion of Japanese culture, the emotion of the Japanese as an explanatory factor.
I love that so much, all the things you touched upon just now. The imagery from 1964 Japan still remains for sure till now, but there's also this other extreme, as you've mentioned, that actually there is still a couple of companies who still use paper instead of computers or fax machines instead of emails.
Yeah.
And also there has been another big, I think, shift in how Japan is portrayed in the media with 311, because I think in Europe particular, atomic or nuclear plants have been kind of seen in a different light starting from there, and Japan has been seen because of that in a different light as well, as a country that is kind of contaminating water at the moment, right? I think that was in the media just now, as a country that wasn't capable of securing a nuclear plant, despite the fact that it's always riddled by kind of disasters like that. So why weren't they prepared enough? Why didn't they send their robots, right? Fascinating. Was there, and my assumption is now that the Olympics of 2020, or rather 2021, were actually there to kind of change a little bit the image, or put Japan,
Absolutely,
of course, into a new light, which probably every country does. It's usually like that, right? But did you observe anything in particular that Japan has been trying now to push?
Yeah, absolutely. So the 2020 Olympics have been very much positioned as the recovery Olympics. So their emphasis has been on 311, on the 2011 disaster, and showcasing how Japan has recovered from it. Which is interesting because the Olympics are held in Tokyo, which wasn't really affected by the disaster. So it's not exactly clear how a great Olympics in Tokyo shows how they've recovered from a disaster that took place elsewhere. But part of their commitment for this was actually holding events in the affected regions. So in Fukushima, for example, that they would have these events. And one big part of it was the Olympic torch relay, which is currently ongoing. It started in March, about 25th of March, I think, and it's going through every single prefecture. And part of this was that they were starting in Fukushima to show how much it had recovered, and that was the aim anyway. But actually, there's been a lot of controversy over this, which has been less apparent in British media, although it has occasionally come up. It really depends on the publication. But there's a lot of controversy in Japan because there are concerns that actually there hasn't been sufficient recovery in Fukushima and the other affected areas, that the levels of radiation are actually still too high, that there are people who are still displaced, still haven't been able to return to their homes, and there is this strong public movement against the Olympics for this reason. So yeah, it's a very difficult one, with this desire for this to be a recovery Olympics, but without actually having the Japanese people and those who are in those recovering regions actually supportive of it. In addition to that, as you say, most countries do try to use the Olympics to showcase what they are today and what they will be in the future. Olympics are seen as legacy events, that they will have these long-term impacts. So the 2020 Olympics was certainly meant to be transformational. Whether it will be now that it's being held in the context of COVID, where it's recently announced there'll be no foreign spectators, or potentially even no Japanese nationals spectating. It could be empty stadiums. It's still uncertain. But going back a few years, going back to maybe 2015, 2016, back when the plans were really starting to accelerate, the then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, he had these quite ambitious plans for the Olympics. I mean, there was going to be this huge overhaul again of the infrastructure of transport in Tokyo. So just as 1964 brought in new subways, brought in the Shinkansen, 2020 would bring in more electric vehicles, more autonomous vehicles, having robot taxis, for example. But in addition to that, what Shinzo Abe wanted, running a parallel to the 2020 Olympics, was a 2020 robot Olympics. And he wanted to bring robots from across the world to compete in events. And since then, there's nothing that's been said about it as far as I can tell. I've done research looking at, trying to find this information in English or in Japanese, that he had these big plans and they were definitely firmed up and they were approved, but no discussion since. And actually, I think it does kind of highlight this disparity between the image that Japan wants to put out, or the image that people want to see of Japan as being this super high-tech place with robots, and the reality of the situation. Because in addition to a robot Olympics, they wanted to bring in robots to help the running of the Olympics in some regards. So, for example, there was a desire to have robot guides who could help you get to where you're looking for.
Like
peppers. Yeah, something like that. And I remember being at Tokyo Station in 2016, I think it was, it may have been 2015, and they were doing a trial of one of these robots. And it was advertised as this humanoid robot that had roller skates, and it could zip around and take you wherever you needed to go. But the reality of it was, when I went and I actually tested it out, sure, it was a humanoid robot and it was sat on a plinth. And you told it where you wanted to go, but it didn't communicate with you. It didn't move. All it did was, behind the robot was a TV screen that then just brought up a map of where you were versus where you wanted to go. So really, no different to just using Google Maps on your phone, or whatever Maps app you want to use with voice recognition, asking Siri, asking Google, asking Alexa, whatever. there was absolutely no difference.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I think that you have these lofty ambitions, but I think sometimes they fall short of reality, really.
Buzz, let me just jump in. Sorry. And then I'll let you ask your questions. The Olympics stand for equality, diversity, right? But instead of focusing on that part, Japan is deciding to play into its, well, apparent strength, the image that it already has, that it's a very high technology or advanced country with fast trains, samurais, and lots of robots everywhere. Why wouldn't it more focus on these parts that is actually not doing well at the moment, right? The controversial parts, like the tennis player Osaka, for example, right? She's Japanese, but she has been criticized for not being Japanese enough. There's been a lot of inequality between female and male citizens, and the Olympics could actually change or at least impact that image of Japan being a bit more equal and diverse, and it doesn't do so. Is that because it's kind of holding on to its tradition and holding on to, this image that it wanted to build back then, like in the last century, what you mentioned at the very beginning, that it is kind of like this nation with a strong identity that is in a certain way very polite, that looks in a certain way, that speaks in a certain way. Is that somehow related? I'm not sure if you can answer that, but I find that very interesting and fascinating, and that's why I'm kind of bringing it up. And
yeah, no, it's very interesting. I'm not sure if I can answer it, but it's certainly something I'd love to discuss and hear your opinions on. I think that a lot of it is to do with what Japan sees as the purpose of the Olympics, and it's making a value judgment about what is going to have the most positive impact on the country, and perhaps they've made a decision that focusing on these elements that up until now have worked for its soft power, so its global reputation for its technology or its traditional culture, its food, for example, cuisine, sushi and things like that, and all of these very successful elements that drive tourism, that drive positive perceptions of the country internationally, outweigh what you could say are very serious and real issues within the country, and are considered more domestic politics than international politics. And perhaps maybe that's the reason. And again, I'm not a specialist in international relations or politics, so don't take what I say with a pinch of salt, but perhaps that's what they're seeing. These issues such as gender and race and inequality, they see these as domestic issues that they may not want to solve with a global event like the Olympics. I mean, certainly we've had the controversies. We had the politician that said that women talk too much during meetings. Wasn't he the head of the Olympics organizing committee? He was very quickly dropped and replaced with a woman. And there has been an increase in the representation of women at these senior levels. So they are sort of making these positive changes, but only as a reaction to controversy. And historically, this has been something that has characterized Japan, that it only affects these changes due to external pressures, and very often foreign pressures. So you have this term gaiatsu, so external pressure. And there's a lot of studies that have been done about it. I'm not an expert, but really the thrust of it is that Japan will only affect changes. The Japanese government will only do something when there's a significant buildup of external pressure. They won't make these changes by themselves. They won't do anything themselves. It has to be imposed on them. And I think that's a really interesting thing.
And it's explainable through history as well, right?
Because absolutely.
The US has kind of pressured Japan back then after World War II.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about it, the Japanese constitution today was effectively written by Americans.
Yeah.
It's based on the American constitution, but aspects of it, which the majority of the Japanese population love, such as its commitment to pacifism and not holding an army, not maintaining an army, that came from the Americans to prevent them from becoming belligerent powers again.
Yep.
You know, it was seen as a way of curbing the power of Japan. It's been embraced by the Japanese people. This is seen as a positive change, but only occurred because they were forced to do it. So yeah, no, absolutely.
Oh, definitely, yeah. Yeah, that's a very fascinating conversation, really. I mean, you can see, I mean, the nature of these events that represent diversity and such, I think, you know, it's not the first event to be wrought with controversy. I think a lot of these sports events that, you know, attempt to represent such values, they often fall short. And if anything, it's more of an opportunity for the country to present itself, you know, primarily in the eyes of a tourist, maybe. I think, you know, like living in a country that's going to be hosting the World Cup next year, that there's a lot of implications about that. So, you know, I can definitely see where Japan's coming from. But no, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. So I want to try to bring it back to what we were talking about with the media now, if you don't mind. And I just want to like sort of center it back to your own experiences with British media. Sure. And sort of ask you, you know, going back to, you know, before you started researching the subject and you growing up in Britain, what sort of made you gravitate towards researching Japan? And what was your initial impression of Japan before you started researching it?
Yeah. Okay. Now, that's a really good question. I think in the UK, we have a much more limited exposure to Japan than sort of our European neighbors. So certainly when I was growing up, my first exposure, like a lot of people, was to Japanese pop culture. So it was to anime, and actually no, pretty much exclusively anime, but only a selected sample of anime that made it onto British television. So things like Dragon Ball Z or Gundam or Pokemon. There was a very limited range of sort of Japanese popular cultural products that made its way to the UK that could be consumed by a mass audience.
Yeah.
And I didn't even know they were Japanese at the time. You know, they were dubbed into English. I just saw them as cartoons. You know, they were showing on the same channel that showed American cartoons or British cartoons. Whereas, say, compared with the experience of mainland Europe, so France, Germany, Italy, for example, where manga and anime had such a much stronger hold historically and popularity with the youth, and then as they grew up and became adults, where there was actually a much closer association between those products and Japan, that people knew they were consuming Japanese popular cultural products. Manga was available in most shops in those countries. There was a lot more anime on television as compared to the UK, where it was practically impossible to buy manga unless you were getting it from a specialist stockist. Really, in the UK, anyone with an interest in Japanese culture, be it popular culture, it was their interest made them part of a subculture, and they had to find films and anime and manga through those networks, which meant that it didn't have widespread acceptance, and it meant that my own experience was very limited. Really, a lot of what I learned about Japan came from more historical things. So I loved watching history documentaries as a child, starting with the British and the European history, but then, you know, you'd find Asian history documentaries come on, learning about the history of China and then the history of Japan. And that was really my first real exposure, consciously seeing Japan. In terms of British media representing Japan, there were a few programs on television. For example, there was a program hosted by popular TV presenter Jonathan Ross in the UK, who had the series Japanorama, which was a long-running show where effectively he showcased the wackiest things in Japan he could find. And that kind of format of finding the crazy in Japan was very popular. And another popular genre of program in the UK was the Japanese game show. So we had Takeshi's Castle in the UK, which was an adapted version of Takeshi Kitano Beat Takeshi's long-running Japanese game show. And what they did was they took the raw footage from this game show and rearranged it, taking out any kind of structural narrative from the actual Japanese program, adding in new effects and new titles, and providing a new voiceover. And it basically took this already quite fun game show and exaggerated it, created new characters and new narratives and new stories behind what was going on. And so growing up, the actual British representations of Japan I was being exposed to was very much this weird and wacky Japan, as we were talking about towards the beginning. And yeah, so I did kind of have this mix of different images of Japan. So when I became aware that the cartoons I watched as a child were Japanese, when I was watching these historical documentaries about Japan, and then this weird and wacky Japan. So I was having all of these different images mixed. In terms of how I came to be researching Japan and this media image, it was something of an accident, to be honest with you. So I decided to study Japanese at university because I was very interested in the culture, in the history and the language. And I wanted to give myself a challenge. And I thought, studying Japanese language, you don't get much more challenging than that, especially in languages. You know, I'm quite comfortable speaking some European languages. If we wanted to, we could do this podcast in German, but we'll leave that for now. We'll stick with English. But yeah, I wanted to push myself, and I thought Japanese was a good way to do that. And I really enjoyed the research aspect of the university experience, actually finding out things, solving problems. And when I started my PhD, I wasn't looking at the media. I was looking at technology specifically in Japan and looking at this specific example of fax machines in Japan. So in 2012, I'd read this article about fax machines in Japan and how they were still being used and they were everywhere. They were ubiquitous. So I thought, that's interesting. I'd like to know more. Why is it that they're using them? I wasn't totally convinced by the simple explanation of it's rooted in Japanese culture and Shinto. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more and sort of extrapolate, well, if they use it there, why don't they use it here anymore? And that was the basis of my research. And so I went out to Japan and I started interviewing people at companies to find out about their fax usage. Why was it you're so obsessed? Why do you love using fax? Why don't you like using email? Things like that. And it very quickly became apparent that most people at most companies, at least those that I interviewed, don't like using fax machines and avoid it at all costs if they can. By and large, daily communication is done by email or by phone, as is the case in the UK or any other country, really. You know, everyone has an email address. It's very easy just to quickly send off an email. But fax machines and fax machine usage is still there because there are just certain cases where it's unavoidable and they literally have no choice other than to use it. And it particularly comes down to when you need a signed document and you need evidence that it's not fraudulent. And because the Japanese use stamps rather than signatures, which is, it's a unique part of their history and Asian history as well, because they have them in China historically. These stamps made it more difficult to switch to digital signatures.
Yeah.
We can draw our signature with a finger or stylus onto a screen. You can't do that with a stamp. And these stamps are registered with your bank. They're registered with the local government. They're official stamps. And that means when you need a document that's been stamped, that it's been approved, that it's been verified, that needs to be transmitted in a way that's secure. And for a very long time, just scanning it and sending it as an attachment by email wasn't sufficient because it wasn't seen as very secure. Whereas a fax machine, which is literally a point-to-point communication, you put a document in one end, it comes out the other. It's very direct. There's no intermediary connection. Whereas when you're sending an email, it goes through different servers. It goes through so many steps before it reaches the inbox on the other side. There is a small chance of it being intercepted along the way. So the fax machine was seen as secure. And that's why banks required it, hospitals required it, and offices required it for, particularly large companies required it for sensitive and important documents. And so that was kind of the first stage, my realization, well, actually, Japanese don't love fax machines. They have a pretty good reason for using them. That they're limited, or were limited anyway. As I say, online signatures, digital signatures have grown in acceptance, and there is now legislation that allows them. But for a long time, it just wasn't possible, which meant that fax machines had to be used no matter how cumbersome and inconvenient it was. So that was the first step. The second thing I realized was that actually fax machines are still used even in the UK. And it's for the exact same reason. When you need a secure transmission without any risk of any hacking or anything like that, and you need to know that what you're receiving is a direct copy of an original document. So lawyers, doctors, and even universities still regularly use fax machines. It was only until very recently that the major football clubs did all of their player transfers with fax machines, because that's how you sent the contracts, because it was secure. So that was the second thing. It's not just a Japan thing. It's a secure document thing. So this made me go back to my original premise and think, well, why was I thinking that Japan was obsessive about faxes, that it's this unique cultural thing? And I realized it's because I read this article on the BBC, that I read what was in the media and I just accepted it. I didn't question it. I didn't think, well, that seems a very basic explanation for something. It's assuming a lot about Japanese culture. I just read it in a newspaper or a news website and thought, it's in there, it's factual, it must be accurate. And so that's when I spun my research on its head and started to focus on what it is the media is saying about Japan and why is it that they're saying these things, and to a limited degree, what basis in reality is it that they are taking for these things. Because in my research, I'm never claiming that these news articles are wrong. They're not totally inaccurate, because for every stereotype or every inaccuracy or misrepresentation, there is some kind of basis in fact. Fax machines are being used. They're just not being used in quite the same way or to quite the same extent as the news articles suggest.
They are cosplayers, right? There's sushi, there's
yeah, absolutely. These things that we see in the media about Japan absolutely exist. But it's that sort of framing that you just focus in on that one thing. So with the cosplayers, with the sort of more exaggerated elements of Japan, that's because when they take a camera to make a TV show about Japan, they point it at Akihabara.
Yep.
And Akihabara isn't that big. It's a couple of blocks. And then all around Akihabara is just normal Tokyo. But they focus in on these bright lights and the colors and the cosplay and the schoolgirl outfitted maids from the cafes and things like that. They just focus in on this one very small area.
They do that because it sells?
Absolutely.
It sells.
It does sell. It does sell. And if you think about the media, it exists to make money, really. Even newspapers, yes, they are there to inform you. But now more than ever, with this shift to online consumption, making money is so important. You're no longer just selling, say, an individual newspaper. Every single article on a news website has to generate money. And so that was one of the things I did with my research when I was focusing mainly on the press. I was talking to the journalists out in Japan, because I think an important thing to recognize is that journalists, especially those who are based in Japan, working for British newspapers, American newspapers, wherever, they're not ignorant of Japan. They know it very well. Several have PhDs. They all speak Japanese language. Some are married to Japanese women. They're very knowledgeable about the country and have lived there for decades. They know the subject matter in depth. The issue is that they're not in charge of what they write about. It's their employers. And very often, these journalists aren't full-time. They're working on a freelance basis. And so they're paid by each article that they write. And so they'll get told, today you're writing an article on robots. And it's a choice between writing an article on robots or not getting paid. And so it's a very difficult one. And when I was speaking to these journalists, they made it very clear that where possible, they would try to bring in some balance. If they were told to write about robots, they would try to avoid exaggeration. They would try to tell it as it is. And if the robot was a bit rubbish, they would try to say that. The problem is they'll send that article to the editor, who will say, well, this isn't wacky enough. This isn't exciting enough. Rewrite it. Or they'll rewrite it themselves and give it a completely different headline. And it is problematic, but as you say, it sells. And it's the same with the television media, that it's very often it's entertainment. So when you have these television shows where they take a celebrity or a comedian or some other personality who isn't an expert in Japan specifically, you're putting them in Japan for the purposes of entertainment, for the purposes of attracting viewers. So what's more interesting, taking a British comedian and putting them in a very mundane, everyday Japanese environment, or taking this comedian and putting them in something a bit crazy, something a bit unexpected, or something that the British public will have heard about. So putting them in a room with samurai or getting them to dress up like a geisha, that's going to get more viewers. That's going to entertain people. That's going to make money.
Yeah. That is the very entertaining part, and that's exactly how it is portrayed. You touched upon it indirectly. So I think for us would be interesting, what do you hope to do with the research now? What do you hope how do you want to have your research influence basically the outside world, let's say?
Oh, that's a very big question.
From it, kind of.
Well, it depends how ambitious I want to be. I mean, as an academic, my research can only have a certain reach, really. It's people who read academic articles. But, if I were to be ultra ambitious and, we'll see how I go in the future, I would hope that my research could lead to some change in the representation of Japan abroad, encourage news publications, television producers, and so on to show Japan that's more than the sum of these stereotypes, to show Japan it's more than just this same selection of things every single time. Japan is incredibly diverse, as we've kind of said, and there's so much more that could be shown, and probably more interesting stuff that could be shown. I'm not saying that when you make a television show about Japan, you show the boring everyday lives of the Japanese people. Of course, that wouldn't be entertaining. That wouldn't make money. But Japan is a big place. It's a very diverse place. And there's so much going on and so many interesting things about Japan. Why is it that every single program will just do the same episode about Tokyo, episode about Kyoto, an episode about, I don't know, Okinawa or something? You know, there's so much to Japan, you know, in all of the 47 prefectures, that you could show something completely different and show a side of Japan that isn't normally shown, but is just as interesting. And as well as that, not just focus on the differences, not just show Japan as the other, as the Oriental, but also to embrace those similarities, show that the Japanese aren't completely alien, as is very often done. And I'm very aware that this sort of part of my ambition is very difficult to achieve. You know, whether the news producers or the television networks would read my stuff, and whether it would actually affect what they do, because they just want to make money. And these depictions sell, and the journalists have to make money. It's sort of a vicious cycle, really. So if I pare it back a little bit, what I really hope is that my students and the others that I reach through my research, so maybe the people watching and listening today, is I hope they just become more critical of what they read or watch, to question the accuracy and representativeness of what they're consuming. And, you know, this sort of relates very much to a wider issue, a separate issue, but related, in that these days especially, there's so much mis and disinformation, especially on the internet. You know, we now have this fake concept of fake news. It's so prolific now, it's everywhere. That critical media literacy is hugely important. You just shouldn't blindly accept whatever it is you read. And that doesn't just extend to these big issues about coronavirus and dangers of vaccines and 5G and stuff like that. It actually also impacts these unexpected things, such as, you know, how Japan or a foreign country is perceived by the media or depicted in the media. And I suppose that's another thing I'd want to make a point about, that my focus is Japan. And Japan is really all I know, but Japan is a case study in many ways of how the media looks at a foreign country. This sort of thing is done with so many different countries, so many different groups, in that othering, in that orientalizing, in that stereotyping. And so even if people don't have any specific interest in Japan, if they can take anything away from my research, it is just to engage critically with what you read and what you consume, and realize that it is just that very particular framing, taking that very particular part of a culture and just blowing it out of proportion to say that this is the whole, when in fact it's just a very small part.
Well, yeah, Chris, I couldn't have said it better myself there, Chris. Honestly, you have an insurmountable hurdle to cross with this ambition, and I think you realize that. But you know, I think it highlights, like you said, a long-rooted, deep issue with how the internet and media functions today. You know, beyond what COVID represents for fake news, misleading headlines, and clickbait titles, I think this sort of represents an era where you know, entertainers, whether you like it or not, or influencers, have a much bigger role to play in the dissemination of information on a day-to-day basis, particularly when it comes to the youth. Because more and more, I think traditional media is losing its ground with a younger generation. They feel alienated. Often these traditional media outlets sort of misrepresent the youth in general. So I'm not surprised when they feel alienated and don't, you know, feel inclined to, you know, get their news from such places. They want to see what's new and what's hip and what's the new innovation that's happening in the field, and that's through people who are streaming, people who are influencers, people who understand how digital works and have mastered it. And when you're consuming so much information on a day-to-day basis from the internet, it's only natural that you'd gravitate towards someone who feels more relatable to you, someone that who breaks down things for you. So it's a very difficult situation we live in today, and like you said, it extends beyond the pressing topics on the news. It comes to simple things like how a certain person or a country or a subject is portrayed, and that has so many implications to how an audience sort of reacts to that certain subject. And I can only imagine, just from what you were mentioning about your reaction to the fax machines article, what that did for your own perspective. Imagine the entire British population, what their sort of impression is. At least you did your research. You read a lot about Japan's relation to China and that sort of history. Imagine for your general population, it's something else. And I grew up with, to relate to something you said earlier, I grew up with Takeshi's Castle. I grew up with Dragon Ball Z. So I can relate deeply to what I watched, and I didn't actually realize that it was edited to exaggerate it further. Because I always thought that was the nature of the show. So it's actually quite shocking to me for you to say that it's actually been edited to exaggerate it even more. And I think I can see that pattern in British media in general quite often, actually, is that, one of the shows I watched back in the day, An Idiot Abroad, he goes to more than one country, but I just thought, the way they portrayed his experiences, it's hilarious, to be honest. It's like, even for him visiting Jordan, for instance, somewhere I'm very familiar with, or even Japan, I could realize that this was obviously very exaggerated, but I can only imagine for someone who's never been outside their own country before, haven't experienced those sort of things, that has very big implications to how they see the world or certain things. It's a very important subject. So I really want to thank you for this really important research that you're doing, and for sharing your insights on the show today. I've gone on a bit.
No problem at all.
Yeah, also to add, thank you, Chris, for doing that research, really, from a different angle, because you were, with your research, actually making Japan a little bit more representative, actually, right? You showing what Japan actually really is, and should look like, is a bit, it's not the right impression, but like you portrayed, or you basically pointing out that the media has been portraying it in its extreme ways, rather than actually how the reality, I'd say, or how Japan really looks like. And that's really essential, I think, to have, or vital to have that kind of research. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you guys again for inviting me on. It's wonderful to sort of reach a very different audience as well. When I'm doing journal articles or preparing papers for an academic conference, quite often you're preaching to the choir almost. You're talking to these people who are well aware of these issues, who will agree with you, of course, because they themselves feel that, and because they're knowledgeable about Japan, they're experts. So being able to reach an audience who maybe is still interested in Japan, but doesn't necessarily have that same academic background, or hasn't ever considered these issues from this perspective before. No, it's a great opportunity.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, sir. Is there anything you want to share with the audience before we wrap things up, or maybe you could talk a little bit about the online summer program that you're managing? I think that would be in particular interest to our audience.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and thank you for bringing it up. So, as I said, I'm working for the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Cultures at the University of East Anglia. And it's a research-intensive institute that specializes particularly in Japanese arts and cultures, broadly defined. So looking at not only traditional art and theatre and calligraphy, but also more contemporary things such as manga and film. we have a broad range of expertise, and we decided we want to share that more with the world. And so this summer, we're bringing this expertise online to share with anyone who's interested. So we've launched the online summer program in Japanese Cultural Studies 2021, which will run from the 12th of July through to the 23rd of July, which is the opening day of the Olympics. And we're sort of organizing this online program around three central themes of sport, science, and sustainability. Sport, obviously, because the Olympics, and then these wider issues as well, which tie into things like the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and wider sort of pressing global issues, but through the lens of Japan and through a very interdisciplinary lens. So, we're not trying to attract people who are experts in sustainability or scientists or people in sports science. This is very interdisciplinary and it's very accessible. It's a completely free course, and we're going to bring together some leading experts from our own institute, from the university, but also across the world. And yeah, it's completely free to join, and there's no expectations of any formal education in Japanese culture or language. We welcome anyone who's interested to sign up and join us for that 2-week period in July.
Thank you so much, Chris. And we'll be sure to plug that on our social media channels as well. Really appreciate your time today. And definitely, you heard the man. Everyone check out this program. I think it would be definitely interesting in the lead up to the Olympics. I think it's going to shape a lot of your perspective of what's going to happen this year. So I highly recommend it. And thank you all for tuning in today. And I'm sorry for a couple of the issues I had with my personal audio in the beginning of the episode, but nothing we can't salvage. Everyone else here was fine, so don't worry about that. It's just I had a couple of issues. But thank you so much, Chris, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you for having me, and yes, have a great afternoon, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.